Good morning, everybody. I know we're live streaming, but I can't see you with all of those lights in my face. I need to put my hat back on so I can see you. Well, thanks for coming. Most of us through our lives have studied the teachings of Jesus. And we ought to study the teachings of Jesus. But it occurred to me one time I would like to study what Jesus did. How did he react to people? What was his interactions with people? To a certain extent, how did they respond to him? How did he treat people? Because I think sometimes as Christians we get so caught up in the doctrine that we fail to recognize I'm supposed to act a certain way when I'm in this situation. You remember the old, what would Jesus do? Well, this class is what did Jesus do in his own life. Now, I'm using the PowerPoint because I don't have a blackboard. That's old-fashioned. So I'm going to be posting scriptures. There's no fancy pictures with this or anything. It's just going to be the scriptures where you can go to it. And since this is a Bible study, I hope you have a Bible with you, either in physical form or on your telephone or however you want to do it. We're going to start today, but then we have a break next week when Israel is here from Mexico. And so we'll start today and then we'll pick it up in 2 weeks and then go from there. As I look at Jesus' life, he could be really straight with some of the folks he interacted with, blunt with some of the folks he was with. But as I thought about those interactions of Jesus and the people around him, I discovered two kinds of people. And Jesus treated them very differently. Now, one group of people is terrifying to me because I grew up in this environment. I know what a Pharisee is. The other group of people were what I call the triers. That's not very good grammar, but it's what I call the triers. These are the folks who are hanging in there the best they can. They make mistakes. They mess up. Life doesn't go exactly the way they had hoped it would go. But Jesus hangs in with those folks. And so I want to look at those two different groups of people, the sayers and the triers. And some of this may become biographical. I don't know. We'll see. The first group we're going to look at are the sayers. Now, this is the group that Jesus, well, they're his enemies. And what's going on is, to put this in some historical context, the Pharisees were the restoration movement of the first century. And I mean that in every sense of the word. They were the purifiers. They had come to the conclusion that Judaism had gone down the tubes and that people were not keeping the law of God as they ought to keep it, and they wanted to restore Judaism to the time of Moses. And they worked very hard at that. In fact, as we're going to see in a moment, Jesus says, you sit in Moses' seat. In other words, Jesus acknowledges what they were doing. In fact, he will say, do what they preach, and then he will go ahead and basically say, but don't do what they practice. So this was the restoration movement of the first century. Now, I say that for some very particular reasons. One of them is we need to be sure that we think about ourselves carefully. Are we, in our desire to purify the church, which is a totally legitimate thing to do, or are we going to do something else? Now, I recognize I got to stop here and put a parenthesis. How many of you know what the restoration movement is, what that term even means? Anybody? Good. It's nice having an older crowd. But we've got some young ones here who knew what I was talking about. At least, well, two. The Restoration Movement was started in the late 1700s. It was a religious movement that started in Scotland and Ireland under under Thomas Campbell and then later Alexander Campbell. Their perspective was we need to go back to the New Testament because they saw the old light, anti-cedar, burger Presbyterian church which is several descriptions of the church they were a part of in Ireland and Scotland. And so they wanted to create a unity movement. Well, the sad thing is, as we have gone through the years, we've become less a unity movement than a protectionist movement, doing exactly what the Pharisees did. And that's why I think a remembering of what the Pharisees did can be very important to us in our time today. Turn to Matthew chapter 9, verse 9. This is the context when Jesus calls Matthew to be an apostle. Have any of y'all seen the show, The Chosen? Comes on Sunday afternoons occasionally. Well, the calling of Matthew is fascinating in that little movie because he seemed to be a very introverted kind of guy. But he collected taxes, and he had a Roman guard, according to the story, and he was behind a cage where he collected the money and all this, and he became a follower of Jesus. Well, this is where this happens. As Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth. "Follow me," he told him, and Matthew got up and followed him. Fascinating thing to me about Jesus. And I don't think it's miraculous. When Jesus said, "Come follow me," they did. They left everything. It's amazing how they just pop up and go with this dude. There's a lot of ramifications with that. Jesus was incredibly charismatic, and people followed him by the multitudes. We'll talk about that some more later. Verse 10, while Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" What's he doing running around with the rabble, with those third-class citizens? On hearing this, Jesus said, now notice his reaction, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, for I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." Jesus was so unusual because he accepted the sinners. Mary Magdalene, a bunch of others similar to her, men similar to her in different kinds of ways. One of the most intriguing things about Jesus to me is how many women followed him. We're going to look at that in this lesson. It may be in 2 weeks, but we're going to look at it. How many women followed Jesus? And the miraculous thing about that is nobody ever raised any questions about his inappropriate relationships that they could accuse him of. This is a religious leader. He's a sitting duck for people to bring charges against him for all kinds of reasons. But that never comes up. In the 2,100 years since then, that has never been a charge brought against Jesus, that he was somehow immoral. Now, there is this crazy, nutty story that got started about 10 or 12 years ago that Jesus had a wife, and her name was Mary Magdalene. That's a lie. That's a pure lie, unpure lie. But the concept is these sayers are people who perceive themselves as the righteous, and they're looking down on everybody who's not like them, the sinners. But they perceive themselves as righteous. And Jesus doesn't do well with people who act better than themselves. Second one is in John chapter 9. And I just remembered we're live streaming this thing, so. This text is probably the scariest passage to me in the Bible. It's certainly scary to me personally because of the implications and what it says. John chapter 9, beginning in verse 28. We have this situation where man has been healed of blindness. And the Pharisees are questioning him about it. In fact, they put him under oath in verse 24. Give glory to God. We know this man is a sinner. And the blind man replied, whether he is a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see. That just cuts through everything. You can do what you want to about it, but I was blind and now I see. And they get into this conversation and putting him down, as it were. They ask him, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? He answered, you can hear his exasperation. I told you already, and you did not listen. Why? Do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too? Then they hurled insults at him and said, you are this fellow's disciples. We are disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from. The man answered, now that's remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. And then here comes a line that's not exactly true. We know that God does not listen to sinners. I grew up hearing that. This is not Scripture talking. This is this guy giving his interpretation of religion in support of Jesus. He listens to the godly man who does his will. Nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. But is this man were not from God? He could do nothing. To this they replied, and notice how human the reaction is. Instead of dealing with the conversation, instead of dealing with the charge, instead of dealing with the argument, they say, you were steeped in sin at birth, how dare you lecture us? And they threw him out. Jesus has no patience with this kind of person, with the kind of person who has the world divided according to their own interpretation rather than God's interpretation. Verse 15, Jesus heard that they had thrown him out, and when he found him, he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? Who is he, sir? Tell me so that I may believe in him. Jesus said, you have now seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking with you. Then the man said, Lord, I believe, and he worshiped him. Jesus said, for judgment I have come into the world so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind. Isn't that interesting? Some Pharisees who were with him heard him say this, and they asked, what, are we blind too? Jesus said, if you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin. But now that you claim you can see, your guilt remains. Now that's the scary line. Does that get your attention? But now that you say you can see, you're blind. I was one of those. I grew up in the Church of Christ version of Pharisees. I was steeped in the Restoration history. I loved Restoration history because I love history anyway. But I was steeped in Restoration history, and the picture that I was taught in college was a very idealistic view of the Restoration movement. We were such a great unity force, and the unity just prevailed. And then I started reading real Restoration history when I became an adult and started wanting to preach and decided I needed to find out for myself before I started spouting off hearsay evidence. The seeds for our divisions started early on. Because we had become convinced that you've got to be like me if you're going to be saved. There's a thing called naive realism in church conflict. It's called, I know the truth. If you see the same material I see, you will agree with me. And if you see the same material I see and you don't agree with me, then you don't care about the truth and you're just a lost person. Does that sound familiar? I see clearly. If you don't see like I'm seeing, then you're not having access to the same information I had. So let's have a Bible study. Because when you see the material as I see it, then you will agree with me. It's the typical teenage argument. Y'all remember this? Here it goes. Can I do this? No. But you don't understand. And they've got to give you some more information, because if you have more information, then you'll agree with them. And you say, no, again, and they say, but Mom and Dad, you don't understand. And then they begin to give you some more information, thinking that with you have the same information they have, they're going to agree to let you do it. And they say no again, and that's when teenagers go nuts. They've given you 3 opportunities to agree with them, and you haven't done it, so something's wrong with you. You don't care about me. You don't want me to have any fun. Ta-da-da-da. Does this sound familiar to anybody? Rearing our kids and raising our kids, and then watching our kids raise our grandkids, and they do the same thing. So that's what's going on here with Jesus. Now I want you to notice his attitude. One of the things about Jesus is, and the question arises for us is, do we imitate this? And I would suggest, yes, with this proviso, that we do a thorough self-examination before we go into any other direction. Jesus' attitude, and this is what we're looking at, his actions and his attitude. His actions and his attitudes toward those who were self-righteous, who thought they had it all together, and who knew they were right, was not very patient. He didn't have a whole lot of room for them. And it's important to notice also that Jesus is not making judgments about them. He doesn't see them and just automatically come up with some assumption. Jesus is reacting to the things they were doing. They were proving themselves to be the kind of person that Jesus is going to criticize, like for here. You say you can see, you're blind. There's a part of me that still has trouble, and you can ask Ann about this. There's a big part of this that I have trouble with because I still think I know everything. Part of it came from being a preacher. Because when people come to the preacher, he's supposed to have all the answers. And for most of my preaching ministry, I thought I was supposed to have all the answers. Out of 40 years, probably 30 of them, I thought I had all the answers. Then I began to realize, number one, I don't have all the answers, and 2, I don't even know what you're talking about. And could come to the place where I could say, I don't know, let's look it up, let's study, let's, talk to this person, go look at this text. But I was sort of like that, and still sad to say I have to wrestle with that because I was taught that I'm supposed to know everything. Am I the only person in here who has taught or thought or believed or acted as though they knew everything? Well, there are a few of you who are willing to admit that. And Jesus' response to them was they talk a great game, but they're not willing to play much of the game seriously and intentionally. So let's come to Matthew chapter 23. This is a tough chapter. Now, you do know that Jesus didn't talk in chapters. The joke in textual history is that Erasmus, who divided up the Bible into chapters and verses, did it on a stagecoach on the way to Paris. That's why you have such weird divisions in verses sometimes. That's the joke. I can tell you right now, standing up here and y'all over there, I feel like the rich man and Lazarus. There's a big gulf between us. Matthew chapter 23. Now, Jesus is going to say some very tough things in this text. And I want us to see them in terms of what's he saying and why is he saying it. And is he just making judgments, or is he responding to what's going on around him? Chapter 23, verse 1. Then Jesus said to the crowds and his disciples, "The teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. So you must obey them and do everything they tell you." Key concept. Obey them because they're sitting in a position of religious authority. They are teaching God's word. The problem is, but do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. And this is the problem. This is the challenge. They know God's law, and it's very clear that they do. They know about Moses, and it's very clear they do. They have a deep appreciation for the law of Moses, and they do. But the problem is they don't practice what they preach. They don't live up to what they talk. And Jesus sees that their actions are so different from what they are saying and what they're preaching. In fact, notice verse 4, they tie up heavy loads and put them on men's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. Now that is the definition of a disaster. One of the challenges that confronts us as Christians is when a person converts, and you do know that we don't convert somebody. I know that's the language, but we don't convert anybody. They convert themselves. They change. The conversion takes place in their lives, not in what you do. I never have said, well, I converted somebody. I baptized them, but I didn't convert them. God's word converted them. They converted themselves. And sometimes we convert people and really tie a burden on them because we don't develop them into disciples. We don't tell them the rest of the story. It's like having a child born but never teaching them how to eat, never teaching them how to put their own clothes on, never teaching them how to go to school, just expecting it. 6 weeks old baby, okay, you're on your own, kid. Figure it out. Well, that's sometimes what Jesus is talking about here about these Pharisees. They put this heavy burden on people when they convert them. And there was a mission work among the Jews of that first century. They did a lot of trying to convert people to Judaism and trying to teach them about Moses' law. You see the power of their influence later in the church when they're wanting the Christians to become Jews first. Well, that's all a process of wanting to make people Jews, convert them, or they convert to Judaism. But Jesus recognizes what's going on, and he says about them, forget it. It's not working. In verse 5, he describes them as a people who are doing their religion to be seen. Everything they do is done for men to see. They make phylacteries wide and tassels on their garments long. They love the place of honor at banquets and most important seats in the synagogue. They love to be greeted in the marketplaces and to have men call them rabbi, which was a remarkable term for not just teacher, but an exalted one kind of approach. The concept here is, and I don't like preaching or teaching without a practical application to ourselves. As we look at these Pharisees, we have to examine ourselves to see, am I like that? And so these were people in their day who, phylacteries was a leather band that went around their forehead. They put it on their arm and they wrapped it around their fingers in a certain specific way. They wanted phylacteries to be seen, and they wanted the tassels to be seen. I guess it's kind of like preachers used to wear suits and ties. Except I had a friend, this just occurred to me. I had a friend who was a deacon in the church, and he wore a white shirt and tie everywhere. I went over to help him put a hole in his ceiling to put a chimney in. And we were on top of there, and he had a white shirt and tie on. I don't know that he was doing that to be seen by anybody. That's just his uniform. Well, these people wanted to be seen. We've sort of lost that picture in the church. We don't compete for see who looks the nicest anymore. Women don't see how much a white of a hat that they have to wear to beat somebody else. Do y'all remember those days? Some of you. The point is, religion was not for self-examination. It was not for a self-evaluation. It was not for self-improvement. It was not to focus attention on oneself to be better. It was for the purpose of getting everybody to notice me. And they had reduced Judaism, they had reduced religion to that concept of, I'm doing this for people to see me. Does anybody remember what Jesus said in contrast to looking for the places of honor at the banquet table? Anybody remember what he said? He said, go to the foot of the table. Sit at the edge of the crowd, and then they'll invite you to come on up to the head table. That's what Jesus said. Don't push yourself to the front because you're going to be embarrassed because somebody's going to move you to the back, was the concept that he was trying for us to understand. When we begin with humility, then we will be exalted. But if we begin with the attempt to be exalted, we will get humiliated. And Jesus sees this in their lives, and he has no place for it. Verse 6. Where am I? Okay, verse 5, they do to get seen by men. And verse 6, they love the place of honor at banquets, the exaltation of themselves. In verse 15, he says, woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You travel over land and sea to win a single convert, and when he becomes one, you make him twice as much a son of hell as you are. Woo! That's coming from the mouth of Jesus? Let me put that in a context. When I was in college, one of the greatest men I have ever known was a man named Dr. Abraham Malherbe. He was a white South African. He had converted in South Africa by early missionaries. He had come to the States. He had gone to Abilene Christian. He ended up going to Harvard. He got his PhD at Harvard. He gave the valedictorian speech in Greek the year he graduated. Incredibly remarkable man. And I grew up with the idea in my corner of the church that those people with PhDs were suspect. I remember sitting in class, this is true. I remember sitting in class and all of a sudden the thought hit me, he really is a Christian. And I was embarrassed to even have that thought, because why would I doubt it just because he was educated? Dr. Malherbe went on to Dartmouth, and then he ended up at Yale, and he became the dean of the School of Theology at Yale. He was a member of the congregation in New Haven. He was an elder in the church there, and he was an active visitor in the hospitals and meeting with people's needs. He's just an incredible man. Well, in college, he told us, don't go to the mission field if you go with guilt, because we don't want you dumping your guilt on us. And that's what Jesus is saying to the Pharisees. You go make a convert, but you don't have your head on straight in terms of what a convert should be. You don't have your head on straight about the relationship that you ought to have with God. You don't have your head on straight about your relationship with people around you. You go and make them more of what you are, which is a Pharisaical legalist. Now, when you think about Jesus saying this about people, it may make us nervous. I mean, to say you made them twice as much a child of hell as yourselves. Well, that's a pretty good put down of them, saying that they were children of hell themselves. That's pretty strong language. I don't think I've ever used that of anybody. But why is he doing it? What is his attitude? What is he doing? He is not accepting fakes. He's not accepting false religion. And he's not accepting their self-induced description of their holiness and their righteousness. He just didn't have room for that. And it was always based on their reactions to him. Verses 16 through 24, they manipulate the sacred. Let me find it in here with this light. Woe to you, blind guides! You say, if anyone swears by the temple, it means nothing. Temple was sacred. But if anyone swears by the gold of the temple, he's bound by his oath. That's what you call playing games. You blind fools, which is greater, the gold or the temple that makes the gold sacred? You also say, if anyone swears by the altar, now that's sacred, it means nothing, but if anyone swears by the gift on it, he's bound by his oath, and that sacrifice was also sacred. You blind men, which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred? Therefore, he who swears by the altar swears by it and by everything on it. And he who swears by the temple swears by it and by the one who dwells in it. And he who swears by heaven swears by God's throne and by the one who sits on it. Now, most of us probably grew up thinking you can't swear to the truth. That's not something we do. I remember as a kid, early on, I think it was I went to work for the Texas Highway Department, and you could swear or you could affirm. And I affirmed, not realizing at the time there's not a hill of beans difference between swearing and affirming. It's the same thing. So I don't care now if they say, do you swear by something to be on a jury? Fine, yes. What they're doing here, however, is not doing that. What they're doing here is they're taking the sacred and they're manipulating it for their own purposes. They're manipulating the altar, the gold, the sacrifice. They're playing games. What they're really doing is, anybody ever remember King's X? You tell the truth and cross your finger behind your back, and that means that you don't have to tell the truth. Anybody remember that game? Creating loopholes. Mile-wide holes is what these folks are doing. And again, I want you to notice and emphasize this because this is the important thing. Jesus is acting upon their self-actions. They're doing what they want to do. And Jesus doesn't so much judge them as He reacts to the way they are. Sometimes as Christians, we have to have discernment. And when we see things going on around us, we have to make choices about how we relate to them. When we lived in Iowa, we lived on the top hill coming out of the Cedar River Valley, and the church had bought a huge mansion that had been sitting on this top of the hill of the whole town. And that was where the church met for years, and then they built a new building. Well, our house was the carriage house. The preacher's house was the converted carriage house. It was so slanted you could put a marble on it and it'd roll to the other end of the house. Had no insulation under the floor, so when it got to 10 below zero, the cold came up through the floor. No insulation. Well, anyway, there were no storm windows that cut out the wind. The first winter we were there, when the wind blew, the curtains would blow. But they started taking better care of the preacher, and they put on storm windows and put on carpet so they'd insulate the floor a little bit. And where was I going with that story? That's crazy. Story was better than the point. If I think of it, I'll bring it up. Scott Peck is a man who wrote the book called The People of the Lie. And notice this description he has. People who are evil attack others instead of facing their own failures. They construct layer upon layer of self-deception in order to avoid the pain of self-examination, and by doing so, often succeed in deceiving others. The people of the lie are the people who believe the lie. Some people are liars, and when they believe the lie, that's when you're really in trouble. That's when life can cave in on you. The rest of the story was living on that hill in Cedar Rapids. A fourth of the town would come down one side of the church building and make a left turn right behind our house to go out to this quadrant of northwest Cedar Rapids. Well, on this occasion, ice had covered the street, and this guy in a Volkswagen came around the curve and slid in a driveway sideways. Now, the problem with that is, by this time, we'd already had multiple inches of snow, and it had been shoveled off the driveway, and now it had turned into hardened snow, ice. I mean, pillars of ice. And he slid into there, and I saw that happen from our kitchen window. So I ran and got my big coat on because it was cold. I went out, and I helped the guy get out to go on down the street. He went down the street about 4 houses, and going straight, he slid again into the driveway. And I said, okay, buddy, you're on your own. If you can't go down the street without sliding sideways into a driveway, you've got bigger problems than I can help you with. That was where Jesus was coming from. He was seeing these kinds of people who are evil and attack others for the inability to agree with them. Jesus did not have patience. I can get you out of the ditch multiple times, but if you're going to keep falling in the ditch, there comes a time, like with the Pharisees, when Jesus said, enough is enough, let's move on to something else. He was not accepting of their views of religion. He accepted them as people because he criticized them and confronted them and loved them. He looked over the city of Jerusalem and said, how often would I have gathered you together as a chicken gathers her chicks under her wings, and you wouldn't have anything to do with it? He was talking about the Pharisees. He was talking about Jerusalem. The concept is Jesus loved them, but he also recognized with reality what was happening in their lives. The Sayers, I love these folks. Matthew chapter 8, familiar story. But I want us to think about what he could have done. He comes on the storm. Capernaum and the towns that Jesus would go to were on the north end of the Sea of Galilee. The Sea of Galilee, the north end, was right at the end of the Megiddo, at the end of a pass in which the wind would blow straight in from the Mediterranean Sea into the north end of that Sea of Galilee. And you could have a very calm, peaceful day, and a wind would come through that pass and churn the water into a storm that was dangerous. And they were fishing on the north end of the Sea of Galilee because the Jordan River entered at the north end of the Sea of Galilee. And the Jordan River brought all of this food for all of the fish. So that's why the fishermen were at the north end of the Sea of Galilee. Well, this is one of those moments at the north end of the Sea of Galilee. When this storm comes through, they get into the boat and they follow him. Without warning, a furious storm came up on the lake. And it's that kind of phenomenon, when that wind just powered through there, so that the waves swept over the boat, but Jesus was sleeping. The disciples went and woke him, saying, Lord, save us, we're going to drown. He replied, you of little faith, why are you afraid? Then he got up and rebuked the winds and the waves, and it was completely calm. And the men were amazed and asked, what kind of man is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him. Wouldn't you be afraid if you were in a storm like that? A rowboat, maybe 20 feet long. They have since found one of those rowboats in the mud of the north end of the Sea of Galilee when it got really dry and it had been excavated, and you can go see a fisherman's boat. But the thing that I notice about Jesus is he doesn't condemn them. He doesn't get on the case. These people are trying. They don't have it all together, but they're trying. They gradually are beginning to see who Jesus is. What kind of man is this that the winds and the waves obey him? They knew there was something different about Jesus. I would even say there's something strange about Jesus. But Jesus does not condemn them. He does not say, you're such little faith, just go ahead and figure it out yourself. You guys are sailors, you've been in storms before, you take care of it yourself. And I'll help you if you can't do it, but you go take care of it yourself. Jesus does not do that. Because he's dealing with people who are struggling. They're not claiming to be the best seamen in the world. They're not claiming to be perfect in how they handle a boat. They're just trying to make a living. That's where Jesus is understanding of where people are. One more before we have to quit for today. Matthew chapter 14, verse 31. Similar to this one, Jesus feeds the 5,000 and then he sends the apostles away. There's all kinds of thinking in the New Testament and the accounts of these that when he would feed this amount of people, they often would want to turn him into a general on the spot. In fact, I think as John says, they sat down in groups of 1,500. That's what you do with an army. So Jesus would get the apostles out of there before they, in their ignorance, would reinforce what the crowd was doing. So he sends them on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went on up the mountain by himself to pray. And when evening came, he was there alone, but the boat was already a considerable way from the shore. During the fourth watch of the night, Jesus comes walking on the water. They thought it was a ghost. Jesus said to them, "Take courage, it's I, don't be afraid." Peter says, "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water." Jesus said, "Come." When you make comments that you don't know what you're talking about, it's amazing what the Lord may do with that. If it's you walking on the water, tell me to come. Jesus said, "Come." Peter gets out of the boat. He walks on the water. He sees the wind. He was afraid, and he begins to sink and cries out, "Lord, save me." Now notice this. Jesus doesn't say, "Well, you turkey, if you'd had enough faith, you'd have stayed up on the water and came to me. If you can't swim now, you better learn quick." He does not put Peter down. Yes, he's of little faith. He hasn't caught on that people can walk on water when Jesus is doing it. He doesn't have that part. But he's trying. He's hanging in there with Jesus. And his whole life is going to be that span of things. Peter's always coming to Jesus on the water and getting in trouble because he doesn't always know what's going on. But the key concept I want us to notice is Jesus treats the people who are trying with great patience and great sympathy. Now, the point of this to me is, and this transformed me when I figured this out finally, God has so much patience for me that it's ridiculous. He puts up with us in so many ways that it's ridiculous. When we're trying and when we're struggling, He doesn't throw us to the flood and say, "Figure it out." He encourages us. He pulls us up out of the water. He allows us to move on forward. But He doesn't abandon us. And He doesn't kick us out of the boat. And He doesn't leave us struggling in the water. Jesus picks us up. I think that's probably, there's some more to this lesson that we'll do next time. But I want us to recognize that since Jesus did not have patience with the self-righteous and the arrogant and the know-it-alls, because that's what they were. He wasn't making judgments. If I'm going to be dumb enough to slide in between two solid walls of snow and ice, then I need to figure it out. But I can learn how to drive. With Jesus, if I had done that and gone on down the road, he'd come out and help me. Jesus accepts those who are trying. And we have to say, we're trying, aren't we? We're trying. And Jesus is patient with us. He's not so much concerned that we sink when we come to walk on the water. He's concerned that we get out of the water and keep going, keep moving with him. So we stop the lesson now. We're going to finish that up. Next week we're going to look at some people of the land, which is what Luke calls them, who are common, ordinary folks who follow Jesus everywhere. 2 weeks we'll do that. Next week, Israel Molina will be here from Mexico, and we'll hear him. Thanks for coming.